I'm Kirstine Milne, a partner in the transactional construction team at Brodie's. Our team deal with advising clients at the front end of a wide variety of projects. Our 40-strong team of construction lawyers work across the whole of the UK, and many of our lawyers, including myself, are dual Scots and English qualified. Our team is both Tier 1 and Band 1 ranked in the key legal directories Chambers and Legal 500. I advise clients on a wide range of projects, acting for all counterparties within a project, from developers to contractors, consultants, subcontractors and funders, as well as end users. And that gives me a real 360-degree view, which is useful when we're advising parties, allowing us to cut to the chase and reduce negotiations. And I act across a wide range of sectors. I'm joining Isobel today, who's our tax specialist, for this webinar, mainly really to set the scene as to where we tend to encounter queries around the construction industry scheme, or CIS, as it is commonly known. And then Isobel will be considering the detail of what CIS is, who it applies to, and what the changes in the CIS rules may mean for those who are procuring works. My experience is there's a lot of assumptions about CIS, and these are not always accurate, so Isobel is here to set us straight. In the construction team, we deal with contracts across a wide range of contractual forms, from bespoke contracts to using standard forms like JCT, SPCC, NEC and FIDIC. And it's in relation to the JCT and SPCC forms that we tend to encounter queries relating to CIS. And that's because there's an entry in the JCT and SPCC contract particulars that needs to be completed, confirming whether the employer is a contractor for CIS. If we could move on a couple of slides, please. Yes, that's the one there. Just the highlighted entries there are the ones that we need to complete in the SPCC and JCT form. Now, Isobel is going to consider in more detail what this means, but a brief look at the HMRC website provides some clarification, and this is as far as many people look. HMRC's website advises that under the construction industry scheme, contractors deduct money from a subcontractor's payments and pass them to HMRC. And the deductions count as advance payments towards the subcontractor's tax and national insurance. Contractors must register for the scheme. Subcontractors don't have to register, but deductions are taken from their payments at a higher rate if they're not registered. However, one of the main complications arises because a contractor under CIS does not necessarily mean that a party is a mainstream contractor. Next slide, please. So HMRC says you should register as a contractor if you pay subcontractors for construction work, if your business doesn't do construction work, but you have spent more than £3 million on construction in the 12 months since you made your first payments. You're to register as a subcontractor if you do construction work for the contractor, and you must register as both if you fall under both categories. So a party procuring construction works may be a deemed contractor, depending on the value of the works that they've carried out in that preceding year. And this may require parties to monitor their construction spend to see if they'll become contractors. Where we often encounter parties becoming stuck is where contract particulars are copied over from one contract to another. This can be a problem where the contracting entity is completely different and unrelated to the new contracting entity, but it's effectively a style document that's been copied over, pre-completed, and therefore the entry may not have been completed properly or even considered. Contract particulars might be copied over where the client is the same, but it's actually contracting using a different contracting entity. So for example, if it sets up SPVs for different projects, in that case, should the construction spend of the other SPVs, if, for example, they're all ultimately owned by the same top client, be of any relevance? Parties may still be operating under the pre-2021 thresholds. That required one to consider construction spend over a 3-year period, And if that averaged more than £1 million a year, then the party was a deemed contractor. It may be assumed that if the employer is out with the UK, then it can't be a deemed contractor. Or it may be assumed that certain works aren't construction works. So, for example, site preparation or demolition. But the HMRC guidance includes these within the definition of construction work. It may be assumed that because the value of the works exceeds a certain amount, that the client is automatically a contractor for CIS from the very beginning. But what might not be considered is if there's any exemptions which could apply. So, for example, if the client is carrying out works to a building that they're also occupying as a business, there could be an exemption. This could be particularly relevant for tenant fit-out works. And also, if the test is looking at the preceding 12 months, if there's been no construction spend to date, then the fact that it's for example, a £5 million contract may not be relevant. Often when we ask the question of clients and or their project team, they're not sure whether they're contractors or not. And we may be told that they are, but then it emerges that they've not registered with HMRC for CIS, so that can cause them problems later on. It's worth noting that although as construction lawyers, I tend to only be asked the question in relation to SBCC or JCT contracts, but obviously it is still going to be relevant for works done under other construction contracts too. So now I'm going to pass over to Isobel, who'll take us through what we need to know.
Thanks, Kirstine. So what is the CIS? Well, as Kirstine's explained, it's basically a tax deduction scheme. So it involves deducting tax in certain circumstances from payments for construction services. And there are different rates of tax that have to be deducted. At the nice end of the scale, there is 0% if the person that's supplying the service is registered for gross payment. If somebody is registered with HMRC as a subcontractor, but not for gross payment, then they're registered for payment under deduction, and that's 20%. If they're not registered at all, it's 30%. So that's quite a difference. And these deductions do count as advance payments of tax liabilities for the people receiving the payments. However, for the person that's making the payments, there is a lot of admin involved. So there are lots of returns that have to be completed, and there are procedures that you have to go through to check whether subcontractors are registered or not with HMRC. So there's an awful lot of ways in which you might not exactly follow the CIS rules to the letter, where there is a potential for HMRC to penalise. So if we move on, one of the big confusing things is the whole contractors and subcontractors, because in the CIS, it's very simple and it doesn't really tie in with the real world at all. So if we move on, the contractor for CIS is someone who pays for construction services, and a subcontractor is someone who provides construction services. So that is how the CIS looks at things. But obviously that doesn't really map over onto the real world at all. If we move on to the next slide, who has to operate the CIS? They really fall into two camps, the people who have to operate the CIS on payments. There are mainstream contractors whose business is carrying on construction operations, and they might include big construction companies, developers who are doing this all the time and so on. They are mainstream contractors and they have to register. But as Kirsty mentioned, there are also others who are deemed contractors. So their main business isn't construction operations, but they've spent £3 million over the past 12 months on construction services. And this deemed contractor camp can include local authorities, property investors, normal businesses, and so on. So the £3 million over the past 12 months limit is a relatively new one that not everyone's aware of. People still think in terms of the old limit that Kirstine referred to, which was the £1 million a year over 3 years. So this is a much higher limit, but it's over the 12 months and it's on a kind of rolling basis. So you have to continually look back for the last 12 months to see if you've met or exceeded that limit. So if you are either a mainstream contractor or a deemed contractor, you have to register under the CIS. And if we move on to the next slide, the deductions, as we've mentioned, what the contractor has to do is verify subcontractors' registration status with HMRC and deduct tax. Either no deduction where it's gross payment status that the subcontractor has, or 20% where the subcontractor is registered for payment under deduction, or 30% if the subcontractor is not registered at all. The CIS applies to labour only and not materials, provided that the labour is separated from the materials in the payment requests and so on. If we move on to the next slide, the subcontractor receives payment under deduction at 20% or 30%, unless he's registered for gross payment. Subcontractors don't have to register, but it obviously includes cash flow if you do. So it improves it from a 20% deduction, from a 30% deduction to just a 20% deduction. As a subcontractor, you can apply for gross payment status, providing you meet various turnover tests and also provided you have a good compliance history. So it's quite often possible to apply for gross payment status, even if you're not a mainstream subcontractor, and it can be well worth doing. If we move on again, the own use exemption, there is an exemption from the CIS for construction work on property that's used for your own business, as Kirstine mentioned. So a manufacturing company spending money on extending its factory premises, even if they spent more than £3 million in a 12-month period, those payments would actually be out with the CIS. So if it's something that you're building is for your own use, then you wouldn't have to register for the CIS. It is a slightly bizarre situation because strictly speaking, it's only the payments that are exempt and you still have to register. But normally you can just say, well, everything that I'm going to do is own use as well. So please, can I not register? And they'll say, yes, that's okay. You don't need to register. The own use exemption, though, means precisely that. If you're going to let out the property to somebody else, it doesn't apply. So there's a difference between something that you're building in order to use it yourself and something that you're building in order to let it out to others. So let's move along to the gross payment status. Big companies that do construction all the time will have gross payment status, and there's no CIS deductions that have to be made to them. So if those are the kind of entities that you're dealing with, then the CIS is likely to be relatively simple. But you do have to check the position, and there are still other admin requirements. So the contractor has to verify the status of subcontractors with HMRC. So even if it's a household name, big construction company, you're still supposed to verify the status. And there are CIS returns that contractors have to submit. The recent change, or there has been a recent change on the gross payment status front, which is that VAT is now included in the areas that you have to have good compliance in. So you have to have dealt with all your tax liabilities promptly and so on, in relation to not just corporation tax and whatnot, but also VAT now. But worth bearing in mind that you can get gross payment status even if you're not a large construction company in certain circumstances if you meet the rules and requirements, and that can be quite helpful. Okay, moving on. The bit that's slightly confusing for people is that the same business can be registered for the CIS both as a CIS contractor and as a CIS subcontractor. So if it both makes and receives supplies of construction services. And this is one of the areas where confusion creeps in, because if a business is asked if they're registered with the CIS and you don't say as a contractor or as a subcontractor, it may not be very clear, and it may lead to one of the situations Kirsty mentioned where clients think that they're registered, but actually it turns out that they're not, or they're registered as the wrong thing. So there are two separate CIS registrations, as a contractor or a subcontractor, and a company can be registered for both. So moving on, CIS in the real world, it doesn't map over very easily. And if we move on to the next slide, that's a sort of fairly normal contractual chain that might happen in the real world with the employer, main contractor, subcontractor, and so on. And architects and engineers coming in at the side. One important point is that people like architects and engineers are generally not supplying construction services, so they're not, they're not involved in the CIS, but the employer, main contractor, subcontractor sort of side of things will be. But if we move on to see that for the CIS, the employer will be a contractor and the main contractor will be a subcontractor. And furthermore, moving on to the next, if you just move on one, the main contractor, in relation to his contract with the subcontractor, he'll be a contractor and the subcontractor will be a subcontractor. So the main contractor in our picture is both a subcontractor and a contractor. And you can see why it's all as clear as mud, because the employer doesn't think of himself as a contractor at all, but for the CIS, that's what he is. So there's a degree of confusion here all the time in terms of what people are in the real world and what they are for CIS purposes. Okay, so moving on, the boundaries of the CIS are probably much wider than people might imagine. Kirsty mentioned repair and demolition, which are construction operations, but other surprising things, internal cleaning can be if it's part of the construction service. Internal or external painting of buildings can be, and installing heating, lighting, air conditioning, drainage, things that you might not think are construction operations, but they are. Although, as we've mentioned, not consultants. Consultants don't supply construction services. Obviously, if they're wrapped into a design and build contract, that will be a different matter. Okay, moving on to the materials point that we mentioned earlier. They apply to the cost of labor. The CIS deductions apply to the cost of labor only, not materials. So you need an apportionment. If there's no apportionment, then the CIS annoyingly applies to the whole payment. And due to a recent change a few years ago, only the actual cost of materials incurred by the subcontractor qualifies for being excluded from the CIS. So you can't have a kind of markup on the materials. But it is a fact that if there's no apportionment, then the CIS can apply to the whole payment, which is not what people expect at all. Okay, moving on. And again, so the practical CIS issues that Kirstein's already alluded to, people don't necessarily realize that they are a deemed contractor and have to register. A lot of property developers think, well, it's a CIS, it's nothing to do with me. I'm a property developer, I'm not a construction company. All companies in a group have to register. There's no group registration. So the fact that another company in the group has registered doesn't mean that that sort of cures the position for everybody in the group. You have to all register, all the companies in a group, if they are sort of required to register in their own right. And you may need to register, well, you don't need to register as a subcontractor, but it may make an awful lot of sense to do so. But one company can be registered for both. If a company is being sold, then it's one of the things that often comes up in due diligence. Has the company done everything it should in terms of the CIS? And frequently they haven't. We actually were involved in one sale of a client company where the buyer's bank said, sorry, we're not going to buy this company because it hasn't registered for the CIS when it should have done, and it hasn't submitted returns. And luckily we were eventually able to persuade the purchaser's bank that we would get it registered and it would catch up and so on. But that was a fairly hairy moment where it looked as though the sale wasn't going to go through just because the CIS hadn't been properly dealt with. So it is worth paying perhaps more attention to it than is often the case. HMRC did do a lot of sort of looking into the CIS and policing it before COVID started. That has all fallen by the wayside, really, because of the state of the construction industry and the challenges it has faced and so on. But who knows when that might start to come back if the revenue get more resources to apply to the CIS. Obviously, not appreciating that there's a CIS deduction can leave a big hole in the funding for a transaction, and you can lose gross payment status as well if you don't do the CIS reporting correctly. So moving on, the new rules for landlord and tenant payments. This is an area that's caused a lot of confusion and difficulty in the past, because a lot of payments by landlords to tenants actually fell into the CIS in circumstances where nobody really expected it. So moving on to the next slide. Oh, that's just mentioning again, the gross payment status now includes VAT. And from 6th of April 2024, and digital applications for registration as a subcontractor are what is now required. You can't apply by phone. It used to be terribly easy. You could just phone up and register as a subcontractor. Now you have to do it online. So it's worth bearing in mind that that might not be such a quick process. But the big change is the landlord and tenants payment. So moving on to the next slide. Why do we have the new rules? Well, this is an illustration of a cash flow gap that could easily have arisen before these new rules came in. So the landlord here is a contractor because he's been paying, he's been spending more than £3 million on construction industry, on services within the construction industry scheme. He is making a payment to a tenant who is a subcontractor for CIS, but isn't CIS registered. And the tenant in turn is paying a main contractor. So the main contractor who is registered for gross payment needs to be paid and is expecting to be paid £1 million. But unfortunately, the tenant is only going to get 700,000 from the landlord, so we'll have a £300,000 gap. And this sort of situation came up a lot, and you know, things could be done, you could plan around it, but it's really not what the construction industry scheme was designed for. And so the new landlord tenant rules were brought in on the 6th of April. So if we move forward to the next slide, it's a new regulation 20A, if you like to know the technical detail. So it was introduced into the CIS regulations from the 1st of April, and it's broadly saying that a payment under a construction contract is not a contract payment, and being a contract payment is the thing that makes the CIS apply to it. If it's made by or on behalf of the landlord to a tenant or prospective tenant in connection with a lease or enforceable agreement to enter into a lease, and the tenant that occupies it will either will either carry out the construction operations itself, or they'll be carried out under a contract with the tenant. So, and the final one is that the works are primarily for the benefit and use of the tenant. So what does all that mean? If we move on to the next slide, it's that there's various sort of legs to the test here. The parties, it has to be a payment by the landlord to a tenant. So it has to be a payment from in that direction. So landlord to tenant payment, the first illustration underneath that can conceivably be covered by the new rules, but a payment in the other direction from subtenant to head tenant won't be. And similarly, a payment from a head tenant to another company in the group in order to pay for some works to be carried out, that won't be covered by the new rules because it's not a landlord to tenant payment. So although the new rules are incredibly helpful, they're not a cure-all for every situation. So you do still have to be a bit careful looking at the CIS in relation to them. If we move on to the next slide, the lease arrangements, it has to be a payment in connection with a lease or an enforceable agreement for lease. So it doesn't just apply to new leases. It can also apply to things like negotiating an extension to an existing lease. However, it does need an enforceable agreement for lease to be within the new rules. So it's got to be, you've got to have a lease or an agreement for lease which is enforceable. Okay, moving on. Who carries out the works? The works have got to be carried out either by the tenant who's going to occupy or by a third party under a contract with a tenant. So a third party that the tenant is contracting with. And so the landlord's going to have to check, if it's not the tenant that's going to be carrying out the works, the landlord's going to have to check that there is in fact a contract in place at the time of payment, and perhaps require the tenant to evidence that there is such a contract. And if there's payments made to the tenant before a contract has been entered into, then those payments will be outside the scope of Regulation 20A, outside the scope of the new exemption, and so they'll be potentially within the CIS. Moving on to the next slide, for whose benefit is it? So you have to look at the nature of the work and whether it's for the benefit of the tenant or for the benefit of other occupiers. And this is all fairly detailed, as you can see. So you can't just assume that if the landlord's paying the tenant to do it, it's going to be for the benefit of the tenant. It kind of ties in with the VAT treatment, and things that are inducements for VAT are likely to be exempt from the CIS under these new rules, but it's not entirely straightforward. So unfortunately, there'll be a degree of checking and looking into what the position is before you can be sure that the landlord, that a payment between a landlord and a tenant will be outside the CIS. Moving on to the next slide. we've got a couple of examples now to try and explain how all this works. So a landlord lets office space to a tenant. The lease is coming to an end, and the landlord and tenant negotiate an extension. So the landlord is going to pay the tenant to install new floor boxes and internal walls in the tenant's office. So this is a payment from landlord to tenant, so it ticks that box. The tenant is going to carry out the works, so it ticks that box. They're negotiating an extension, so there'll be a lease in place, which covers that point. And the new floor boxes and internal walls are definitely for the benefit of the tenant here. So in this situation, the new rules will apply, and the CIS will not have to be applied to the payment from the landlord to the tenant. So this is an example where the new rules work how people might expect, and there's a landlord to tenant payment, but you don't have to operate the CIS. If we move on to the next slide, not all payments are exempt, and you have to check out all the details of what's actually going on. The landlord decides, the tenant decides to sublet part of its space to a subtenant. The landlord agrees to this and will fund some works to partition the existing space. The tenant engages a third-party contractor to carry out the works. This is potentially exempt from the CIS because it's for the benefit of the tenant and is being carried out by a contractor appointed by the tenant, because it's being the tenant has engaged a third-party contractor to do the work. But as you can see, it's not entirely straightforward, because it is for the benefit of the tenant, but it's actually part of the space is being sublet. But this is in one of the HMRC examples. So HMRC do accept that this kind of arrangement would be okay. So it's worth looking at the HMRC guidance for situations that are not entirely straightforward. If we move on to the next slide, this is following on from the previous example. Before the works start, the landlord and tenant vary their agreement so that the tenant will also undertake some roof repairs and replace windows in other parts of the property. So here we have, well, it's actually the work is relating to parts of the property that are not occupied by the tenant or the subtenant. So this isn't for the benefit of the tenant or the subtenant, and so the CIS will actually apply to this. The unfortunate thing in this example is that because the CIS applies to part of the work, it applies to all of it. So even though when we looked at the previous example, it was going to be exempt from the CIS, for this example, because in addition to the work that was going to be carried out for the benefit of the tenant, there is now some work which isn't for the benefit of the tenant. The CIS applies to the whole lot. So you can see how if this sort of thing is tacked on to an existing arrangement, it can bring the whole thing back into the CIS. I mean, obviously, this could be worked around because you could split it into two different contractual arrangements so that you could get the landlord-tenant exemption on part of it. But often you can get the situation where the CIS implications have been looked at initially, but then changes are made to what's going to be done, and that unfortunately changes the CIS analysis. So it isn't, although it's an excellent development that there is now exemption for a lot of landlord and tenant payments, it's not just a magic bullet that takes all of them outside the CIS. And you do have to look at the arrangements quite carefully. Okay, I think that's the, oh, no, it's not the last slide. So what do you do? What if the new rules don't apply? Well, you've got to monitor the construction spend. So this is a sort of hopefully helpful flow chart. If the landlord's a mainstream contractor anyway, then the CIS will apply, and they'll have to operate it. If they are already a deemed contractor, then they will have to operate it if the anticipated spend takes them over the limit. So sometimes when you're looking at these things, although people are not already deemed contractors, you know that as a result of these works that are about to be carried on, they will become deemed contractors. So it's important to make the parties aware of that fact and aware of the requirement to register and so on, and the fact that the CIS will be deductible unless the tenant's able to register for gross payment. And you have to keep monitoring it. And that's not going to be in any way part of the construction documentation because, as Kirstein's illustrated, it doesn't say a great deal in there, but it's worth looking into the potential for people to actually have to register in the future because of the current project. So I think that is the last slide, and that's our contact details. So I think we have a bit of time for questions.
Yep. I think there's a couple of questions, Isobel, that have come in, so I'll maybe just read them out for you.
Okay.
So the first one I think is just wanting a bit of clarity just in relation to whether the CIS applies to overseas developers. So I think by that, I mean companies that aren't registered within the UK but are carrying out works within the UK.
Yeah, so the position there is that the CIS applies to all construction work that's going on in the UK, even if the person that's doing it is non-UK based. So the overseas contractor does have to register for the CIS. The CIS does apply. And actually, there's a special registration system which overseas contractors have to go through, and it can take longer to register and so on. So then they don't get out of the CIS altogether. They do have to register and the CIS does apply. But conversely, the CIS doesn't apply to construction work that's carried on outside the UK. So I hope that clarifies that one.
Thank you. And I think the other one is just in relation to the enforcement by HMRC. So what sort of penalties can someone expect to receive if they fail to comply with CIS?
Well, the penalties can be quite substantial because they sort of mount up. So if a CIS return is late at all, it's £100 penalty. If it's more than 2 months late, it's £200. If it's more than 6 months late, it's either £300 or 5% of the tax. And then when you get to 12 months, it can be another 300 or 5% of the tax, or it can be 100% of the tax. So depending on what approach the company has taken to the CIS, you know, whether they've been careless or whatever it is. So you can see that the penalties can mount up significantly. And certainly before COVID, we were encountering HMRC levying or seeking to levy 6-figure penalties on big companies for failing to deal with the CIS and do all their CIS returns and registrations and whatnot. So, I mean, generally that could be knocked down a bit by things like whether the subcontractors were registered for gross payment anyway, so there wouldn't have been a deduction and blah, 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 but it's still an awful lot of money. Even if you don't think it might apply to you, it's worth checking to avoid all these penalties racking up because of failure to deal with the CIS.
Thank you. And I think that's all the questions that we've had so far. So there's just another minute, maybe if anyone else does want to put another question in the Q&A session. But just to give people another few seconds, just in case. And also, if anybody does have questions that they that maybe come up later or that they've not felt comfortable putting in the Q&A, then obviously Isobel's details are on the slides, in particular in relation to CIS. If there's any general construction queries, then feel free to get in touch with myself. You will be sent a copy of the recording in a few days later, once we've just done a little bit of editing in relation to that. That should come out to you by email. So I don't think there's any other questions from anybody. So probably just leaves us to say thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks
Bye.
very much for joining us.